Ever wondered if robots could walk, talk, even think like us? Let's dive in. I'm Dr. Carl Strathern. This is your inside look at humanoid robotics embodied AI. In this series, we'll explore how lifelike robots are reshaping everything's science daily life. We'll break down how these machines move, learn, and interact, just like humans, ready to meet the future face to face. Hit subscribe and join me as we unlock the secrets of humanoid robotics.
Hello, I'm Carl Strathern, and I'm going to be talking to you today about something that's come up a few times recently, and it's this idea of this broadening gap between academia, education, and industry. And I want to kind of make this the topic of discussion today because I think these two different domains should be working together, right? And the idea is that education should be putting out graduates with the skills that industry are looking for, and at the same time industry should be supporting academia and helping academics and lecturers and professors to understand what kind of skills they are looking for. And this is kind of problematic, okay, because we tend to silo students, okay, in universities. So we have a computer science department, we have an engineering department, design, so on, so on, so on. And students tend to work in these silos, okay. And the idea obviously is that eventually there would be some, interdisciplinary work between these schools and departments, but the reality is there's very little. And this is kind of because of the framework, right, of how academia is usually set up. Like, we have departments and they have specific fundings and targets and how things work, and having a student that wants to work across these different disciplines becomes a problem. And it also becomes a problem these days when we have programs that are pre-designed. I was speaking to a colleague last week who studied in America, and they were kind of saying, you have these core modules, but essentially the rest of it is up for you to decide, and you can pick and choose different modules to meet a specific skill set. And we tend not to have that, really. We tend to have these kind of very general module structures for our programs. And it becomes problematic, right? Because if you're doing a mechatronics or a robotics degree, the chances are not all those skills will match up with something like the humanoid robotics industry, just because there are lots of factors to it that are outside of those traditional kind of, engineering skills. And you kind of need to have understanding of programming languages, and you need to understand AI and how to train models. You may have to do, virtual simulation stuff, sensors. And because everything's compartmentalized, and we teach essentially what should be a single pipeline in separate components, students don't really get to experience what it's like to build robots, putting all these things together, these blocks together to build something tangible and unique. And also the problem is that we don't teach the how to link these blocks together, right? So you take embodied AI, and as an example, computer vision, dialogue management, sensors, potentially a bunch of other stuff, right? You can be on a program that teaches individual parts of this, but not how these things link together. Okay, and this is really important, teaching those in between bits. Because without that, you don't really understand how these processes fit together. It's a bit like a jigsaw, right? And the real complexity doesn't come from the individual components. It's fitting them together and getting them to work effectively as a single pipeline. And then another kind of issue, I guess, on the education side is that education universities are kind of bleeding out, right, financially. So we have this scenario where industry is kind of bloating, like there's a lot of funding, a lot of hype going into it, and a university is on the opposite end of this. And then the question is, well, we don't have the resources to actually teach the skills that industry are looking for, particularly humanoid robotics, obviously I'm talking about here. And I guess one of the missions that myself and my colleagues do are trying to get some of these core skills into schools at a lot younger age. So we work with kind of very simple social robots, and teach how vision and language work together, and tracking and expressions. Okay, and it's a fun and tangible way to learn core STEM skills, right, and AI skills in a really accessible way. And then we see the opposite side of this, where industry needs to invest in education, right? Materials, courses, equipment, provide more apprenticeships, and get the right skills to the right people. I see all the time online recruitment agents saying that the most difficult thing is finding graduates with the right skills. And that's because the skill sets change so dramatically from company to company. And I have an example of one student who, there was a job that was up for a year, right, in humanoid robotics. It was a posting that was obviously so difficult to get an interview for and meet the criteria that it was up for a year. And he was actually working on doing small courses to try and meet the criteria. Okay, and then obviously there's two problems there. You're going to spend like the best part of a year having to upskill to meet the requirements, and the second part of this was, if someone comes along in the meantime and takes that place, and you've kind of spent so much time tailoring yourself towards a specific job spec that it'd be quite difficult to change it to something else. So again, like this idea of industry really being clear on what they want, and also providing some of those materials, and obviously the government as well, especially in schools and colleges, getting that right equipment in is really important, right? Really important going into this new Industry 5.0, because all that's happening is we're just getting this skills gap between schools, colleges and universities and industry, and it's only broadening. And it's a real issue at the moment. And kind of moving on to a little bit more onto the industry side of this, like I said, industry wants practical skills, right? Hands-on, interdisciplinary, being able to work on embodied AI, modular robotics, all these kind of stuff, and also the simulation packages. Now, the chances are students are not going to get that sort of hands-on work at undergrad level. They may do it at masters. Not very likely. For a master's, you get 6 months to really do a project. And what can you do in 6 months? So that's not likely. And then the problem with doing something like a PhD is if it's usually funded or run by somebody who wants that student to work on a part of their existing research. So they may gain skills, like it may say humanoid robotics on it, and they may gain some additional skills over the 3 years of their PhD, but in actuality, they're probably very niche skills that align more with the lecturer or professor who's the director of those studies. So this is what I'm saying about industry needing to provide more kind of graduate opportunities, apprenticeships, but also looking forward to, let's have this clear communication with universities and colleges and say exactly the skills that we're looking for from students, not just putting them in a job spec, right, because they get lost. Actually be clear, have this clear pathway communication saying, this is the technology, this is the software, this is the hardware, this is what we want students to focus on. And if they can, provide some examples of that, right? And that'd be really helpful for us, especially kind of putting together materials, going into those masters kind of levels where, they have options. Okay, options to do their own project and maybe able to use some of those industry materials to design a project that aligns with a specific, organization or company. But this is where it also comes in from the industry side of things and the business side of things, where they have this sort of overprotection sometimes of the USP and a lack of transparency. And you kind of see it more and more where industry are using videos as proof of concept, as proof of the capabilities of a robot, and that's not right. That's not the correct way to do this. We shouldn't just be using videos as supported evidence, right? There needs to be scientific, peer-reviewed journal and conference publications, and that needs to happen. Until that happens, we're going to be stuck in this kind of zone where industry are kind of protecting stuff, maybe stuff they don't want the rest of the world to know about. Maybe it's the processes that they're using or the software or something, and then we have academia kind of not being able to fully trust what industry is doing or understand things. And I kind of see it a lot, this kind of safeguarding from industry. You see it. I guess Tesla is kind of an example of this, where recently the new head of production after the previous head of production has also left, and now you see the program kind of and the production delays from that. It's kind of the expectations, right? I think with the humanoid robotics industry, there's this expectations up here, wanting to produce something and get it out and make sales, because that's how you generate, obviously, revenue in business and research and development. And there seems to be this tendency to want to kind of push stuff out quickly, rather than doing the research and development that takes years and years and years and years to get something robust and usable. And obviously the problem is always going to be if you put something that's unreliable out there into the wild, you're kind of setting a standard, right? And in doing that, you kind of put on the customer side of things and your client side of things that they're going to be working with updates all the time. They may have to manage this robot if it's going faulty, or it has to be kind of carefully configured and confined to certain areas and certain tasks. And this is a problem, right? And I think that if we had this greater connection between industry and academia, then this may not be so difficult, right? We could do the research and development in academia, the building and deployment in industry, and then we'd have more of this circular kind of framework going on, where also within that we have graduates getting into the right places. We are developing things, we're testing things to make sure that it's scientific rigor and ethics are upheld, and we're not trying to hype things up. So yeah, I think there's real value. And one of the things that I learned from the UK Robotics Expo that I was at the other week was that the UK has real potential to take things in our own direction, kind of start again. And it's kind of interesting because not everyone kind of, if you watch my previous video, I talk about kind of the UK birthing humanoid robots, right? With Eric and Alpha being kind of these first practical examples of humanoid robots. I think now we have this opportunity to start producing our own robots, producing our own systems and components. But it's going to take a step back, right? At the moment, this hype is to push out and produce robots that may not be reliable, and that's only going to cause setbacks, and it may even result in the collapse of the industry. Whereas if we took this step backwards slightly and we started again and we said, right, we're going to set up this infrastructure where we have industry and academia working more closely together on things and using this as a test bed, and then within that have the mechanics side of this and the programming side of it kind of outsourced locally, nationally, shall I say, to companies. Then I think we have a chance. The problem at the moment is that we rely so much on external international shipping, and I think if the UK robotics market does boom, we will have to work with the international companies that control those components, you know, and there'd be nothing stopping them hiking up the prices or limiting the amount of, you know, of equipment that can be purchased, and that would be a real problem for us, you know, because in the UK we don't particularly develop or create our own systems, our own hardware as much anymore. It tends to be something we outsource and put together here. So I think that's sort of my idea, and how things could start to change, and also have this idea of bridging over disciplines. You know, we need these interdisciplinary skills more than ever. You shouldn't just pigeonhole yourself as one thing. You know, it used to be like you're a programmer and you're an engineer and you're a designer. I think now more than ever there's this clear understanding that you need to understand of how all these things fit together. Obviously you can have people with more knowledge in one area than another, and that makes them experts in that domain. But really understanding how all these things fit together is really important these days. And yeah, I think if those can be resolved, and we can start looking at courses and, you know, skills that encourage, you know, this kind of interdisciplinary work and crossing over these silos, and we find ways to stop putting students, you know, in departments, and they're kind of closed off to other, you know, research skills, whatever's going on, learning. And then if that's kind of encouraged from an industry perspective, industry saying we need these interdisciplinary skills, we need, you know, people with multi-skilled, you know, abilities, then I think that would also put some pressure on academia to change their frameworks, because remember, these frameworks have existed for decades and decades and decades, and I think it would be pretty difficult for universities to change things without really getting confirmation from industry that it's worth doing. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to talk about today. There's been quite a lot of talk about it online and on some of the forums of students, you know, trying to get jobs and just not being able to even get an interview because they don't meet that criteria. And, you know, I find that very frustrating, because then I see on the other side industry saying, well, there's not enough people with the skills we need, you know. And yeah, I think a bit of recalibration between industry and academia is very much needed right now. I'm going to carry on with my podcast series and do the second part of the lost history of humanoid robots shortly. Thank you.